Perhaps you have everything you think you need in life, but still feel that you don't have the direction and possibly the meaning and purpose that you'd like to have. So stay with us as we talk about spirituality and find out the things you can do, or perhaps the things you can stop doing to foster spiritual growth. Stay with us on Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, my name is Shane Whistler, your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And with us today to talk about at least two different directions in spirituality is David Collins with the Community for Contemplative Practice, and Greg McDonald, who is pastor of Central Presbyterian Church. And I want to thank you both for being here and give your time with us to talk about something that maybe we can't talk about as well as we'd like, or some people would like us to. And speaking of that, well, before we get to your first responses, we have a multiple choice. I don't know if we should call it a quiz, but we'll put that up on the screen and let you look at some phrases that perhaps you contributed to talk about defining spirituality. Look at that for just a moment. Spirituality is A, having to do with the core of a person's existence and relationship to God. B, to know, like love, like what it is to be. And C, becoming aware of God's desire to love and connect with us. So if we were picking ABC, which one was right? I think we'll get right to the point and ask David to give a response to one of these that he helped contribute to. Can we name one of those as right, and would you expand upon the phrase you contributed?
Well, I contributed number B, and I got an A for it when I put it on the paper in graduate school. Essentially, it's to say that spirituality for me has much to do with an open-hearted, open-minded appreciation of the miracle that anything at all is. That as we get more and more simple, more and more appreciative and in touch with the fact that anything at all is here, we also come to have a sense of its miraculousness, of its spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Greg, I want to go to your question or your answer to help guide us in our thinking, which was C, talking about desire to connect with God, or God's desire to connect and to love us. Could you say a little bit more about that phrase?
Sure. It's come really out of my own experience. I have experienced over the years that a strong sense that spirituality is first God's act in my life, that God has sought me out. God desires somehow to love me and you and all others. And that it's almost as if God can't do anything else but that, to reveal God's self, because God is love. And that just seems to somehow overflow. My sense is that it's our task, or at least God's yearning for us to also return that love. And that's like taking the time two people who love each other would take to be in relationship. And so over my thick-headed years of trying to run completely away from that, God continues to stay at me, and I'm working at it.
It's one of the points is it's a long journey, and we often want the definition, and folks that are listening, you're not going to hear much more definition or defining, because part of the point is we cannot define exactly what spirituality is. And it seems in recent years that there's been a trend for people pursuing some kind of spiritual connection in their lives. Maybe it is a dissatisfaction with achieving what material gains they have, or the increased confusion. David mentioned the simplicity. We're overwhelmed. We're bombarded with information. And people are realizing that the tangible items are not necessarily the most important. And I think maybe that's why I heard recently reminded of Gandhi's critique when a reporter asked him, what do you think of Western civilization? And he paused a moment and said, I think it'd be a good idea. So do you see a trend in people moving away from the material fascination and moving towards the transcendent?
Well, at the very least, my own background in practice is mixed, but I'm predominantly influenced by Buddhist practice, and specifically the Soto Zen style, connected directly with the San Francisco Zen Center. And just the last 10, 15 years, there's been such an explosion of Buddhist practice all over the country. And I very much suspect it's as you're suggesting, that is one example of ways in which many folks in our culture are interested in a direct, experiential, practice-oriented form of connecting with their life and their sense of the sacred.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to come back in just a second, because you've had an interesting story about becoming connected here in Austin with a religious group, being leader of one that you have formed and having trouble with definitions. But first I want to go back to Greg and get your background for how did your second career is ministry, your calling that you answered. What made you attracted to that, what attracted you, and then specifically you're also a certified spiritual director, something that's becoming more and more known as people choose the discipline of spiritual formation to study. How did that happen for you?
Well, my background is growing up in a large Roman Catholic family, and going off to school in Houston, and then to work for a corporation for 10 years, only to, all along, God pulling me and urging me to something new, and my resisting that. And finally made that decision to go to seminary and to become a Presbyterian minister. We had since become Presbyterians over the last few years of our life, my wife and family. And but yet the mystery of my Roman Catholic background was part of my roots. And I found myself being drawn by continuing education events to monasteries, to do contemplative prayer, to be silent in prayer for weeks at a time. And I just felt a wholeness in that, a healing, a growthful relationship with my God. And then entered a program in Houston at the Spiritual Institute, which is a program put on by a Catholic order of nuns called the Cenacle Nuns, spelled C-E-N-A-C-L-E.
We need that clarification today.
Which is the Greek for upper room. But they have devoted their life to helping others in their spiritual formation. Spent 3 years in a program there while I was pastoring a church in Houston, and continued to seek that same path and to try to help others in it.
Mm-hmm. And apparently it takes a while of intentional work to become disciplined or pursue the spiritual formation in the sense that you can help others.
Well, it does, and yet you never really arrive at that. It's like something you work at all along. But I think that the formation of the certification is solid because of the accountability that's there in that process.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of accountability, David, you said you're very closely connected to the Zen Center at San Francisco.
It's been a place I've done a majority of my personal practice.
Okay. And then you came to Austin, I guess for your second time in your life a few years ago, and tell us what it was like becoming a recognized religious organization.
Well, I more or less had the assumption that spirituality and religiousness was such a precious and important thing in our culture that government pretty much kept its hands off, that our country was in effect founded on the principles of honoring and putting that as a centerpiece of life. And with a master's degree in contemplative theology from seminary in Berkeley, another master's degree in Buddhist studies from Harvard, and a doctorate in clinical psychology where I did a dissertation on meditation, contemplative experiences, both in Western Christian materials and Eastern Zen Buddhist materials. I looked to set up an organization to practice that kind of spirituality. Mm-hmm. I was very much interested in a practice-oriented, experience-based form of religiousness. I wasn't particularly interested personally in a lot of ritual. I was not interested in a lot of philosophical trappings, but on the basic practice of a contemplative orientation, or, word meditation. Zen means meditation. It's the meditation religion. Only to find out that my group was so user-friendly, so simple and non-dogmatic that it was hard for state agencies to believe that it was religious. So it's a long, long story. I won't go into it at greater length, but only on October 28th, after 2.5 years, did I get recognition from the comptroller's office that, yes, I know what I'm doing. This is valid religious organization.
So finally, after a 2.5-year journey, without submitting a definition that withheld some subjective and objective tests of what religion is, you've been granted that freedom to be a religious organization and be tax exempt, because you're more concerned with the doing and instead of writing the creeds and the doctrine. You want to be about practice, and as your name of the group definitely says. To touch just a little bit more on, people talk about Zen Buddhism. I think a lot of us refer to it and are really not sure what we are. And you said Zen means meditation. In just a moment, could you talk about the sense of, I believe when we talked before, you said the sense of spirituality starts with being aware instead of starting with a concept of God that's definable, being aware of life. Is that correct?
You can, of course, go either way. For many, many of us, having a concept, having an image, having an icon is a conduit, is a way to put us in touch with the sacred. For others of us, it gets in the way. And to take apart our concepts, to step into something more immediate and direct, is to suspend our definitions, to get simple is a valuable practice of spirituality.
Get simple. That seems to be a cry we often need to heed in our lives today. I think when we come back, we'll talk about a few ways personally that you have facilitated your own spiritual connections, and also some recommendations for people who haven't tried this before and aren't sure what they even mean by the word spiritual direction. So please stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue, and we will be back in just a moment. Thank you for staying with us for Austin Faith Dialogue. My name is Shane Whistler, your host this week, and with us in the studio is David Collins with the Community for Contemplative Practice and Pastor Greg McDonald of Central Presbyterian Church. And we are going to hang on to a topic we just finished within spirituality. It has to do with keeping things simple. Greg?
Yeah, I was struck by what Dave said. I'm reminded in Mark, the passage where the scribe, the one who knew all the doctrine and all the law, the hundreds of laws, and it wasn't satisfying. And somehow he said to Jesus one day, let's cut to it. What really matters? Mm-hmm. And Jesus said, oh, hear, O Israel, the Lord is one God. Love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And perhaps that has a lot to say about our spirituality, that this love of God for us and us for God is really what meaning and purpose and spirituality may be all about.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it doesn't sell very well because we are market-driven often.
Yes.
And in a recent article in Newsweek magazine, it wasn't very favorable for Deepak Chopra, and his it was subtitled "Spirituality for Sale." So there is some critique about if you want to get the message of having a spiritual life out there, sometimes you're going to conform to the marketplace, and possibly it will be harder to see the message via the medium that is chosen. I'd like to move to perhaps some personal experience that both of you have had, and what prompted you to adopt a spiritual practice, and where did you start? What is the practice for you, David?
It's hard to say, of course, in a nutshell. My mind goes to the fact that I came close to dying a couple times as a kid. For example, a near drowning, went through what it's like to die that way, and also through the quiet ecstasy of coming back into consciousness. Even though it was very unpleasant, take my word for it, it was also wonderful that anything at all was happening. I grew up in a religious family, somewhat conservative Protestant family. And had the opportunity in high school to spend a summer abroad in Italy, a very Catholic country, and had a Jewish sweetheart for a summer. And weren't very many of those in my hometown. And came away, of course, with a lot of questions, which thankfully enough were sort of mind-opening rather than sort of cynical. Ran into some Buddhist studies as a freshman in college, where the Buddha says, in effect, this is the way it is, folks, and whatever you do, don't take my word for it. Go look, go practice. And so it very much appealed to my own orientation to investigate and explore practices like meditation, exercise in being present, exercise, for example, in just breathing, just noticing your breath, whatever else comes up, as a way to be utterly simple, but in the end also to cultivate a quite profound experience that anything at all is here. And through some of the academic studies, seeing that the principles in Buddhist meditation are also very strongly evidenced. There's many kinds of meditation, but many of the principles are very strongly paralleled in other traditions as well. I've been interested in your comments about God's love as a prompt or a source already for our spirituality. I'm presently looking at a book, or working on a book, comparing Zen meditation and the Cloud of Unknowing, Christian contemplative practice, and where the anonymous author of The Cloud says in the get-go that the fact that you are interested in spirituality, the fact you're interested in contemplative practice is already something divine. To let go of anything less than that and sort of rest in that.
Yeah, for sure. I was, as I mentioned earlier, had this yearning and urging to go to these Benedictine monasteries, and I'll never forget spending a week there, and I had this monk who was my mentor while I was there, and you know, I said, it's easy for you to talk to me about contemplation in this setting. And he looked at me, I'll never forget, he said, all the more reason in your setting you must have a contemplative heart. And I'll never forget that, because there were times when I wanted to stay at that monastery. I didn't want to come home. And yet what he taught me was that I can live where I'm at with a contemplative heart. And
How
so-
on earth can you do that? Because the church you serve is right downtown Austin.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what some people want to know. How do you live with that contemplative heart, with the traffic and the construction and the noise?
Sometimes not very well. It's a struggle, you know, and I want to say there's no right way. There's no one way for any one person's own journey of spirituality. That's to limit the Spirit of God. For me, it is in, I guess, two practices in particular. One is centering prayer, where I do quieten myself and go inward and just be with God, without images, without words. It's like two folks who love each other very much in one room, and they don't really have to speak or say anything or do anything, and yet there's great love there. When I do that regularly with a discipline, and I try to do that each morning, my day is different. God's presence to me is different. My consciousness of the divine is real to me in ways that it's not. The other practice is Lectio Divina. I've taken the courses in exegesis, and they're all of value and worth. But for me, allowing God's Spirit to speak to my heart, to affect something in me as I study God's Word, and then to stay with that, whatever it is most instructive to me in God's Word, speaking to me personally.
Could you give a brief summary of Lectio Divina?
For me, it's taking God's Word and reading it in such a fashion that you do it slowly, meditatively, allowing God to affect something within you. It may be a word or a phrase, and from there it may go in all kinds of directions. It's like that divine impression that God wants to give you with that word, that day, that moment in your life.
Mm-hmm. I realize I keep falling back to the definition, wanting to compartmentalize what it is I think spirituality is, talking about how can you do that downtown. Well, I realized I may call it a spiritual practice for me. I love to go downtown to see people, even get on a bus to go for a short errand and realize I'm part of a bigger system. I'm just one part, and see people I would normally see, getting on and off, coming and going, and to have an appreciation for the world and the people much bigger than I comprehend when I narrow in on just my experience. Which leads me to believe, I wanted to find out about how do you balance that individual pursuit and then community connection? Or if you're going somewhere else, that's fine too.
They'll end up connecting eventually, but I'm reminded in both your comments, Greg speaking of having a contemplative heart in whatever situation, your sense of connection, even a little bit of wonder, just walking down a street downtown, reminds me that part of the problem with definition is that when we're looking for a definition for a content that's sort of self-contained and finished, whereas much of contemplative practice is more cultivating a relationship with our experience, our world, each other, rather than arriving at a specific state or achieving a specific goal. It's, in effect, having a relationship, an appreciative, open-hearted communion with whatever's here, which ties very much with spiritual direction and counseling, that many times the various pains or perplexities which come up for us, just to rest in that rather than to have a ready recipe answer right off the bat, sometimes is all the more rich source of healing. As a culture, we're pretty scattered. We're pretty hyper-individualistic. And that's a place where having a sense of community, I think, is very helpful. This sort of practice, a contemplative heart, practice of a compassionate, mindful way of being with your relationship to any experience is, in a word, a practice of intimacy with life. And this can be so rewarding to have a community to support that, share that, deepen that.
The word intimacy is really important, I think. I was thinking that we avoid intimacy with addiction and denial, and the community helps to keep us honest and open and vulnerable in ways that by ourselves we might not.
And having somebody to talk to, whatever you call it, contemplative counseling, spiritual direction can often be very crucial, very important, because in a practice of intimacy, as well as appreciating the wonder of life, we get in touch with our difficult experiences as well.
Austin's known for having lots of counseling, either centers and individuals, lots of psychotherapists, but also now I'm learning anyway, more and more people called spiritual directors. They're helping, and you may not know where to go, but we do have 2 phone numbers we'd like to share with the viewers. The phone number for David's Community for Contemplative Practice, and also Seton Cove, which you can go for spiritual direction there that's interfaith, and some work, your approach is interfaith to some degree. You come from the Zen meditation, but all are welcome. So those 2 numbers are a resource to start. And just to wrap up, we can name spiritual moments sometimes, like the birth of a child, a near-death experience, something that really grabs you, a wedding. But if someone in your ordinary life, what is one brief way you would point them, Greg, to have some spiritual practice?
For me, I think listen to their heart more. I think this return is one that to spirituality is that pendulum that has swung historically throughout the years from a rationalism to a sense of what's important that's centered in the heart. And so listen to that and share it with another human being, another fellow companion along the way, and see where the Spirit takes you.
That's good. Well, may not have been a clear-cut path that we've shared today, but that's kind of the point, but to be on the path. And I appreciate the insight you 2 have shared with us, and encourage in your own way to pursue that peace, that sense of shalom and wholeness, anything that connects you and furthers your spiritual journey. Thank you for being with us on Austin Faith Dialogue.